It's the week ending the 27th of January, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've heard that Donald is actually building his wall, Theresa is publishing a paper on Brexit, and Hussein is losing one of his gold medals. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. The big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And with me today from the week's digital team are Ashley Wassall, Jonathan Harwood and Hollie Clemence. And starting the show, Hollie, what do you think this week is going to be remembered for?
This week I'm asking, is this the voice of happiness?
Please, sir, I want some more.
What?
Please, sir, I want some more.
More?
The 1968 film adaptation of the musical Oliver there, based of course on Dickens's Oliver Twist, and that's the moment when the orphan asks Mr. Bumble, his guardian at the workhouse, for some more food. A far less crucial character to the story, obviously, Mr. Bumble, than Mr. Brownlow, who I played in my primary school production. Hollie, London was a vile, unforgiving place in the Victorian age, but that's all changed now, right?
So you would think from Dickens, but according to a new think tank research that came out on Monday, the Victorians were actually happier than us. And this study suggests that 1957 was peak happiness, and it's kind of gone downhill from then.
I can't imagine the children in the workhouse were happier
No.
than children now. So what does this study actually say?
What does that say about us, I think is the question. But it's an interesting recommendation, which has been mooted before, particularly by David Cameron, that targets of happiness should be put ahead of targets of GDP.
Yeah, what happened with that? Because it was something that they even did
set
they
it
actually
up,
put it into
but
law
then
that there was a
he
happiness
had
index?
Swinging cuts, and everyone seemed to be unhappy afterwards.
Yeah,
so
it wasn't
whether
so
it
wise to
actually
measure it.
worked, I mean, the ONS is a Office National Statistics do actually look at well-being each year, and it has improved every year. So I guess it always boils down to individuals whether they think they're happier or not. But overall, we've allegedly got happier in the last few years.
Well, the thing is, Britain as a country, if you take each individual, has unquestionably got wealthier, even if they feel poor in the context of the time, and
think
the
that's the
opportunities
question,
that are
though.
available are there.
Does wealth equal happiness? I guess that's the ultimate question. And
Let's
does
do
a
it.
country's wealth
Let's do that
equal
question.
happiness?
Ashley, does wealth equal happiness? Are you happy?
Wealth creates the conditions for happiness, but wealth does not equal happiness. And I would like to ask the question of whether or not we're less happy now, or whether we're just more cynical. I think actually the modern age is a very cynical age. We question everything. We don't accept anything at face value. I can't speak for the Victorians. I wasn't there. And I would love to know the methodology of how they decided how happy the Victorians were. But I suspect, there was less of the kind of social media cynicism that we have now, which sort of undermines every good mood you've ever had.
So actually it's about awareness of what everyone else has got rather than necessary disappointment in your own personal lot. I mean, that's sort of essentially what this survey is saying.
Expectation and aspiration, I think, are the probably,
it's
perhaps the
about-
problems.
Jonathan?
You might be extraordinarily wealthy by 1957 standards, but if you don't have the newest iPhone and a flat screen TV, then who are you? And then you look at Twitter, and you're inundated with images from glossy magazines and all these other things that just conspire to make you feel like you don't have the one thing that you need to make yourself happy, which is the one thing that's slightly out of reach.
Well, also as well, the ubiquity of negative news. So you look at the current political climate, this very febrile political climate, and everyone's very unhappy about this, that or the other, without naming names of policies or people that are causing that. But actually, how much of that is actually impacting on people's lives? My life hasn't changed at all. During the Great Recession, my income increased. I got a couple of promotions. I came out of university. I've done very well for myself. And yet somehow I feel quite, worked up about all these political things that are having no impact whatsoever on my life. It's because they are in my face 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They're on my phone. There's notifications coming up about them. We are encouraged to feel angry.
Yeah, but
about
hold on.
everything.
The Victorians did a fine line in sort of penny dreadfuls and some pretty terrible news circulating as well, didn't they?
It wasn't as ubiquitous as social media
yeah.
now.
I don't think everyone went around saying Jack the Ripper seems like a great guy. I think they were frightened too. They had bad news.
But Jack the Ripper existed in a little alleyway in the East End. If you're in Sheffield, you probably wouldn't have heard of him, and if you had, he would pose no threat to you. There weren't these sort of things like ISIS that we have now. spectres like that. I suppose you had sort of political threats, but then the media was so much smaller in those days, and people weren't worried about what might happen. I suppose the hand-to-mouth existence that a lot of people lived then meant there wasn't time to consider what was going on in the wider world.
What do you think are the ways that we can all make ourselves a little bit happier? Because there are these kind of counter movements, aren't there? Slow food, leave your smartphone at the door, digital detox. Do you hold any traction in that stuff?
Itself seems to be a kind of obsession trying to
Yeah.
make ourselves
I
happy. I'm not
think,
sure.
Yeah, this tribalism just annoys me.
I do wonder if it comes after something terrible has happened, like 57's quite close to the war. Lots of people would remember it and they suddenly feel happier because they've had such a bad time, whereas most generations now can't remember being in a war situation and they've got nothing to compare it to, so they think their lives are terrible, but actually they should chin up.
I think coming to your question about how we feel happier, though, I mean, obviously switching off Twitter is one way of doing it, but it's that old. It's just a sort of truism that you just have to stop looking at what everyone else is doing. I think that's the problem with social media, is that you just peer into other people's lives, all that humble bragging that goes on Facebook. Yeah. Whereas actually, if you just looked at your own life and just sat and watched television contently in the evening, rather than worrying about whether the television you're watching it on is smaller than your neighbours who's just put a picture of it on Facebook, we'd probably all be quite cheerful, wouldn't we?
No, I totally agree. Yeah,
We've solved it. We've solved the happiness problem.
It was a vague generalism.
And is there anything really that the government should be doing? I think Bhutan is the only country to have any government policy that specifically promotes gross national happiness.
Yeah, you don't hear it in the Commons, do you? We're going to introduce this policy and our main intention is to promote happiness.
But as you said, Cameron sort of went there.
Would they be laughed at?
Was it better just avoided? Leave people's personal happiness to individuals?
Well, Stalin was big on happiness. Kim Jong-il was very big on happiness. All the great dictators, Mao was keen on happiness. It often seems to be a proxy for something else, doesn't it? If you're poor and starving, let's be happy instead. Don't worry about those things like food. Just make sure that your moral well-being is good.
There is a difference, though, I think, between Stalin telling everyone by posters that they were happy when they were starving and in gulags, rather than someone who's saying, I will objectively set up an index to measure if people are happy.
Why does it need to be a metric? Why does it need to be measured? Why can't you just make the effort?
No, but if you know that you've got a growing mental health issue in the country, then you know that there's probably growing unhappiness. So that's the serious point, isn't it? I mean, and that is a drain on the NHS, and then that is a government issue.
Sure.
Isn't it about trying to find proxies for happiness, though? Like, so, to your point, if we've got declining mental health rates, if we've got increasing rates of home ownership, I don't know, whatever these measures may be, then we could probably take that as a proxy for happiness. I think David Cameron's idea was flawed by being too quixotic, by being too romanticised. It was just, let's all be happy and have an index that says how happy we are.
Kind of phrase.
Yeah, exactly.
People didn't take it seriously.
This was the Cameron that got rid of the British flag from the from anything to do with the Conservatives and all of that. And that was an era of Cameroonian sort of conservatism that died years ago anyway. But something as a proxy for that isn't a bad thing.
Well, we know that you must be a lot happier than the Victorians, because the Victorians didn't have The Week Unwrapped to listen to on their non-existent media players. But thank you very much. Jonathan, you're up next. What have you brought with you today?
Well, we've seen the end of one era this week, but it also could be the start of a new one.
They were offered more than we bought it for. And then the people that made the offer actually was Ferrari people.
Ferrari made the offer?
Was heading it up, decided they didn't quite want to give what they said they would give.
Right.
So we bought.
And do you remember how much you paid for it?
I think 380 million, something like that.
Over a period of time, wasn't it? It wasn't all down.
2 days or 3 days.
It wasn't 380 over a long...
We paid it.
OK, very interesting. And that was a 100-year agreement which gave you the... And that's now been running for how many years?
12 years, I think.
Okay, so there's still 88 to go? Okay,
I'm going to try and see it out, actually.
Yes. Knowing you, I think you will.
Bernie Ecclestone speaking with Sir Martin Sorrell on stage last year at Advertising Week Europe. Well, this week Bernie was, quote, deposed from his position as CEO of Formula One after a takeover from Liberty Media. Jonathan, Bernie Ecclestone completely changed the face of Formula One around the world.
Yeah, I mean, this is a story about the end of an era. He might have been a small man, but he was a giant in Formula One terms, and he basically ran the sport entirely for 40 years. Now, Yeah, he turned it from a sort of amateurish sport to a very dedicated following amongst enthusiasts. But now, it was, in those days it was a bit half-assed, if you like. But now it's private jets, A-listers, Monza, Singapore. It's a global sort of circus with which he was a ringleader. His demise kind of brings a curtain down on that generation of people who had a similar role in different sports. There were the likes of Don King, Sepp Blatter, for whom it didn't end very well, and Joel Haviland at FIFA, Pete Rozelle in the NFL, and Juan Antonio Samaranch, who rebuilt the Olympic Games. All those guys were huge in the sort of 70s, 80s and 90s. But it looks as though that era is over and we've got a new sort of paradigm in the world of sport.
Which is what? Corporate ownership, basically, that isn't about one person's view of it.
Yeah, I mean...
Unless that person's Murdoch.
Yeah, Ecclestone was very keen on deals. He was an excellent deal maker, according to conventional wisdom. Whereas the new owners, Liberty, their business plan revolves around engagement rather than cold hard cash. They're all about merchandising, and which isn't that big of a surprise, but they want to do things like explore virtual reality. They're very keen on social media and looking at new ways of monetizing things, which perhaps the old guard weren't.
But that sounds a bit like what you say in a pitch under the category value added. But really, they want the TV rights, don't they? They're a media company. It is still about the TV rights.
It is very much so. But I mean, there are parallels in other sports. So you look at Spurs, for example. They've unveiled plans for their new stadium, and they've got season tickets going for £60,000 this season, with sommeliers, wine bars, Michelin-starred restaurants, one-way mirrors so you can see into the players' tunnel, things like that. These are new ways of looking at sport rather than just shaking hands on a deal that puts cash in your back pocket.
Okay, so do you think this is, broadly speaking, a good or a bad thing for Formula One fans? Because, you can get into the machinations of the media behind it, but actually for the people who follow the sport and love the sport, is this going to be good?
I think the general consensus is that Ecclestone had sort of come to the end of his reign. He wasn't helping the sport anymore, and Liberty's focus on the heartland, which is Europe basically, and they want to increase its position in America as well. So I think by and large, yes, for the fans in Europe, it will be yes.
I mean, do you think Formula One can get bigger? Because, as you were saying, Jonathan, it's got bigger over the last 40 years. It's not really cracked America, has it? But you wonder where else it is to go in this country. Is it ever going to be any bigger in Britain than it is now? It is a fairly niche thing, isn't it? Holly, do you watch Formula One?
I'd watch Formula One on the television, but I would like to take family members to go and see it, but I couldn't do that because it's so expensive.
Oh.
I think it wouldn't hurt for it to be slightly smaller in a way, like you say with Spurs. What we're talking about, football stadiums getting more and more expensive. Sometimes the bigger things get, the worse it is for fans. So I'm not sure if getting bigger, more corporations getting involved, bigger names getting involved is actually a good thing for all the fans out there.
Although it is pretty boring to watch live. I've been to watch Formula One, and it is just vroom. I mean, it's better watched on a TV or even your mobile phone, isn't it?
I agree with you, actually, because it's all about the technical stuff, isn't it? But still, the British Grand Prix is the best attended sporting event in this country.
Is it?
Because it runs over 4 days at a capacity of 150,000 people.
I think that argument as well, that the sport's got nowhere else to go in its homelands, that's the Ecclestone argument, isn't it? That's what he said. He effectively was suggesting that there's nothing more we can do in Britain. Britain is a popular motorsport venue and always will be, although he kept threatening to take the British Grand Prix away. It will be in places like Italy. He wanted to crack China. He wanted to crack the Middle East in particular. And more importantly, he wanted the money that those people were prepared to pay to bring it there. There is another model, and ironically it's taking a big global corporation to try and bring that model to the fore, which is actually we engage with people on a wider basis. So you talked about football. Take German football, for example. They have much lower ticket prices. As I understand it, higher average attendances, certainly as a proportion of grounds, I suspect, in the top league. And their players are handsomely rewarded. Their game is no less intense. It's no less competitive. They just go about it a different way, which is volume of people rather than price of ticket.
Here's a slightly icky thing, but I feel I should ask it because I think it is part of the DNA of Formula One, and that is safety. But actually, although everyone says, of course, we want the cars to be safer and we don't want any fatalities, we don't want any dangerous accidents, I think back to that film Senna that came out a few years ago. And part of the glamour around Formula One back then, tragic as it was that once a year someone would die.
Well, you had to be a daredevil to get in the car, didn't you?
Exactly. And that's gone. So has that taken some, actually, of the thrill away from watching it for a lot of people, do you think?
They wouldn't admit it, but I think it's undeniable, yeah.
I mean, watching those races that become a procession of, pit stop strategy
Yeah.
to try and win a race. When I was a kid, you were waiting for the immediately after the start pile up. That was the race you wanted to watch. When all the cars are spinning off at corner one and crashing into walls, and who was going to win it.
This season, basically, my Formula One watching process has been to sit there, watch the first 3 corners of the first lap, and then turn off for 2 hours, and then turn on again to see who's won. Because nothing else is going on really.
And this deal with Liberty, does this mean, Jonathan, that we're going to see, ever more corporatisation now? Because Bernie Ecclestone was a bit of a renegade, and actually some of the drama was the accusations of bribery and the allegations of things going on behind the scenes, which, to people who didn't watch the sport, at least gave it a bit of mystique.
Bit of backdrop, yeah. Apparently F1 does not have a marketing department.
Wow.
Yeah, that was just him. It was just Ecclestone. So now, presumably it will. I'd imagine they'll be hiring. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Their plans aren't concrete yet. They've given the vague sort of indications of what they're going to be doing, which involves extra merchandising. They want to compare each race to a Super Bowl. Yeah. So it'll be a week-long sort of razzmatazz and hullabaloo, culminating with a dramatic procession, which at the end Hamilton will win with his teammate Bottas, I guess, second.
But no women.
Yeah, well, Ecclestone was quite severe on that. I mean, and that's another reason he was out of his time. In the interview we used from that clip from earlier, he gave a particularly awkward answer when asked about female drivers. He just said they wouldn't be able to do it, and no one would accept them.
Dress as white goods.
It's
famous.
I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it? Because of course, probably most female racing drivers couldn't compete with the male racing drivers because of strength. But to have a rule that says, well, therefore they can't do it, is ridiculous. Like, clearly, if they could compete, that'd be an incredible PR coup, wouldn't it?
There have been test drivers. Danica Wolff, who's Toto Wolff's wife, I think, she's driven for Mercedes as a test driver. And there was another lady who actually died in a crash, who's a female driver. But yeah, it's just. There has been a kind of institutional barrier there in the form of Ecclestone, I think.
Okay, so you predict there may be in 10 years' time a female racing driver who's competing properly at Formula One?
Well, if Liberty want to increase the popularity of the sport, then it's one way of doing it.
I just hope, coming back to the original point that you'd set out, the end of these great impresarios that kind of ran sport, they're just being replaced by corporates. And I think actually, this is fine as long as they actually start to bring it back to the fans, because ultimately that's what matters. We don't just want to replace one individual corporate monster with one bigger corporate monster.
Ashley is providing our final story today. Ashley, what have you got for us?
So this week we're about to get another dose of Cool Britannia.
Choose life. Choose Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and hope that someone, somewhere cares.
Missed you, mate.
I missed you too, Spud. Choose looking up old flames, wishing you'd done it all differently.
Do you still take heroin?
No.
And choose watching history repeat itself.
Underworld soundtracking the latest Trainspotting film T2, which came out this week. It's been 20 years since we last saw Spud and Sick Boy and Begbie on the big screen. Ashley, why do you think this is a big deal?
Trainspotting is probably my favourite film of all time. What interests me more about the film, though, is some of the reviews I've read. I've not seen it yet, but some of the reviews which are talking about, and inevitably they compare it to the original, how it's not as good, and specifically its legacy, which is regarded that it won't have the same impact as the original. So I think what's interesting to me is, will any film be able to have that level of impact anymore? Have we lost the ability to be shocked by a film? Can anything have the same sort of appeal as that did?
Hollie, has film lost its appeal to bring the nation together?
I'm not sure it has completely. I think it just has to say something new. Obviously, the same message as Trainspotting in the 90s is not going to work now because our entire culture's moved on, and perhaps the youth of today will be the better people to kind of determine what the next genre-defining film is.
It's not saying exactly the same thing, though, is it? Because it is a sequel, but it's about the same characters 20 years later. So, I mean, I haven't seen it either, but presumably this is about getting into middle age. It's not just about, young people going out and having fun, obviously, because things have moved on.
Yeah, I mean, I've read the book Porno, which it's, I believe, loosely based on. But it was definitely about sort of looking back. There was an element of nostalgia about it. I guess my general point is more, within 3 years of Trainspotting coming out, it was within the top 10 of the BFI's list of the top 100 British films of all time. Can you name any film in the last 3 years that would have had a similar sort of impact, that would have immediately risen to the top of those kind of tables and charts? And I wonder, we all live in social media bubbles now. We all live, we've got, the diversity of opinion in culture is possibly more polarised than ever. can we ever coalesce opinion or even diversity of opinion around something in the same way as we could back in the 90s?
Well, my answer to that would be, you're probably right when it comes to films. I can't think of one that would go straight into that top 100, but not when it comes to popular culture. I mean, those box sets that everyone binges on Netflix and Amazon, I could easily imagine Breaking Bad going into a top 100 list of the best TV shows of all time. It is possible to capture the zeitgeist, isn't it? Just maybe not with a cinematically released film anymore. Jonathan?
Yeah, well, I mean, La La Land appears to be heading in that direction, doesn't it? It's got 14 nominations for the Oscars, which equals the record. But yeah, it would appear that series appear to be the thing that people watch now as opposed to going to the film.
And that started when Trainspotting came out, actually. I mean, Sex and the City has as much to say about the 90s as Trainspotting does, doesn't it?
In a sense, there's a difference, though, between being immensely popular and being immensely impactful. So Danny Boyle himself has referred to Trainspotting as being the end of Thatcherism, as, you know, a film that I don't know the extent to which he's saying Trainspotting did that, or whether it was just at the same time as. But I certainly think people refer to it as a film that has changed British cinema, that was the beginning of Cool Britannia. It was a year before the Labour government came in, and all that sort of stuff that happened, and Oasis and 10 Downing Street and all that sort of thing. And Breaking Bad, is that considered to have done the same thing, or is it just popular? Is it just fun? Is Game of Thrones having that same level of impact? Is it changing television, or is it just popular television?
Yeah, there's a difference between political, something that captures the zeitgeist of what's going on, rather than something that everybody likes, which, like you say, is quite hard to think of anything recently.
And why do you think Trainspotting did capture that 20 years ago? Because we weren't all in bars in Edinburgh glassing people and injecting heroin, were we? So why did we all relate to it?
Perhaps there just wasn't a voice for that counterculture that did it as well as Trainspotting, perhaps. The music has quite a lot to do with it. The soundtrack, it captured all the right music of the time.
Actually, the music is a really interesting point, because Danny Boyle continually works with Underworld, doesn't he? And that was fresh in 1996. I mean, although actually their soundtrack of the opening night of the Olympics was great and everything, you know, they're not a cutting-edge band anymore. They're blokes in their presumably 40s and 50s. Instantly, even though he has a great understanding of music as a director, it's not going to tap into a youth culture, is it, if they're the soundtrack?
Yeah, I mean, the film may even fall down on the fact that it's deemed to be a sequel to the original. You know, it's not a film about junkies in Edinburgh anymore. Well, I suppose it is, but it's, you know, it's about, like you say, it's about people in their mid-40s. It's not about cutting-edge youth culture anymore. So the fact that people think it will be because Trainspotting is a bit misleading. It's about, you know, it's about old men.
And so have we seen the end of groupthink popular culture moments, or do you think there's still a place for that? And Jonathan, you write about sport. Sport, surely, football in particular, is one of those things, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, so you get things like the World Cups, big sporting tournaments, the Olympics. That certainly unifies the country still. But then it does it through not necessarily the coverage now. People will be watching something, but they'll be tweeting about it at the same time. So it's not the event occurring in front of you on TV. It's more about your reaction to it.
And from that point of view, the counterculture, youth counterculture, I suppose it isn't happening in the same place as where the establishment grown-ups are. I mean, that's the thing about Trainspotting, isn't it? It was released in the cinema, and your dad would go and watch a film in the cinema. So it was in the same place, in the same way that punk made it into the top 40 charts. Now, I guess it's on YouTube or whatever, and if you're a grown-up, you just don't look at it.
But isn't that the problem as well? Like, so much of the media we consume comes through social medias, and you know, we all hear about these social media bubbles, but they are a thing. Back in 1996, I remember watching a GMTV broadcast that talked about Trainspotting. These days, these things tend to be slightly more segmented. People tend to target their audience more. Look at the way newspapers have become much more polarised. They're targeting a very specific audience much more directly. So in that way, maybe we have seen the end of a film that will coalesce you know, views of both sides. The thing about Trainspotting that was interesting was a lot of people hated it. It was considered to be glamorising drugs. One of the reasons it's had the impact it had is because so many people disliked it. But now I think people who would dislike something like that just wouldn't watch it, or they would criticise it in 140 characters without ever properly engaging with it.
Jonathan?
I think there are more channels for counterculture now than there were before. So previously, in 1996, when Trainspotting came out, the only way to tell these guys' story was in the cinema. There weren't 25 different TV channels, all of whom were commissioning new drama. The only way Danny Boyle could bring that story to the public was on cinema. That I don't think is the case anymore.
Perhaps it will take longer for those things to have effect than you thought in the 90s, when it's at the cinema, there's only a set amount of days you can go to see it on film, whereas now, if you watch Breaking Bad, some of us are only just getting into it now, so it could take years for everyone to for that big boom of interest to happen. Perhaps we just don't notice it as much now.
I think it's interesting you talk about the cast thing as well, though, because a lot of the trailers, certainly the teaser trailers, started off with actually the main selling point was the original cast returns.
Yeah.
You know, the first film wouldn't have been sold on who was acting in it. It was being sold on what it was about, whereas the new film, it's almost been commodified. To your point about branding, it's been commodified. Trainspotting, this film of the ultimate counterculture film almost, has now become part of the establishment, you know, in the same way as we now wear Che Guevara t-shirts to show how we have, you know, freedom of thought.
We end this edition of The Week Unwrapped with my thanks to Ashley Wassall, Jonathan Harwood and Hollie Clemence. For more from The Week, please visit theweek.co.uk, download The Weekday, which is our free iPhone app, or of course you can subscribe to the magazine. And don't forget to subscribe to this to hear brand new episodes of The Week Unwrapped as soon as we release them on iTunes or Pocket Cast or Stitcher, wherever you get your podcast. Just press subscribe on your smartphone. I've been Olly Mann, our music is by Tom Morby, and the producer is Sam Bonham at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.